Dr. Glenn,
Yes, sir.
in this episode, we are talking about how trauma can override a person's core values.
That's a deep one, man. That's a deep one. And oftentimes, like even when you're looking for love, people think that it's love when it's actually a pain.
Yeah, that was an interesting concept that you taught me about when we started working together about a year ago. So before we jump into all this, we're going to talk about defining trauma. We're going to talk about how those experiences affect our decisions real time. We're going to talk about how we've used emotions to overcome those experiences and also how resolving trauma can actually shift our core values. We'll get into all this in this episode. But first, welcome to 12-Week Relationships. My name is Pye.
I'm Dr. Glenn.
So 12-Week Relationships is a platform for better relationships in weeks, not years. And when we say relationships, we mean all of them, starting with the one that you have with yourself and working outwards to your friends, your family, your romantic relationships, all of it, because, well, this is the majority of the human experience is our relationships. So yeah, expect awesome stuff from here. But let's just get into it, yeah?
Let's do it. It's all about human connection.
Yeah. This is actually part 3. We're doing a series for essentially new clients. So new clients that are coming into personal coaching as well as couples coaching. We wanted them to have a series of just kind of fundamental education to sort of kickstart the conversation. Now, granted, you don't have to watch or listen to these before coming in, but it definitely helps to kind of get things going with a little bit of a head start.
It gives you insight into what we're doing.
Absolutely. So our whole process is core value focused therapy. This is what we've developed, what we've trademarked in terms of our therapeutic process. And if you missed the last 2 episodes, be sure to check those out. So in the first one, we talked about what our core values. And the second one, we went to how our core values might not be what we think they are. Now we're going into how trauma can actually override our core values, meaning how oftentimes we can make decisions based on pain and past trauma as opposed to what we genuinely believe and want for ourselves. We're going to give examples of this, but I think it'd be first helpful just to describe and define trauma.
So trauma is a wound that you experience usually in your past, like usually in your childhood. And basically it's something that's unresolved, and in present time, you're still trying to solve it as an adult.
Yeah.
Right. So like more specifically, it's like, like your nervous system, you have a fight, flight, or freeze response. Like if a tiger comes in this room, we're either going to run, fight, or flee, right?
Mm-hmm.
And basically a trauma by definition is when your nervous system and your emotional world, it feels like it has to run, fight, or flee,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like when people are like, oh, if this relationship ends, I'm going to die. If my boss is going to kill me. And they have like these expressions where they're literally acting like their life is on the line when it isn't, in their emotional quality of life world.
It's difficult, I think, for a lot of us to wrap our heads around the idea of trauma. I know that it was for me personally, just because I don't think any person that sees themselves as strong, as successful, as independent wants to think that they've been traumatized. Like we're too good to have gone through those experiences. And maybe this is more so a guy's kind of issue. Maybe for the guys that just feel like we're weak admitting to trauma. But
well, I mean, and I think there's a generalization, like the term is used kind of loosely. So when people say I have trauma, like people assume like PTSD, like you're severe trauma, like coming from a war. But there's degrees to trauma. Like that's a huge trauma.
Or we assume that you're like a fluffy internet
You're just
kid
like,
who's
oh, I'm traumatized
by everything,
by this comment,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like that's not a trauma. That's just you're just hurt,
Yeah.
right? So
overly
hurt. But it's just basically any type of wound that is sustained in your life that you haven't resolved, and it shows because it's kind of repetitive. Like you have the same relationship styles or pains playing out in your life over and over.
And so maybe we can talk about examples of what these might be. We'll give some examples from our own experiences as well as from our case studies. But speaking first personally, I can say that some of the trauma that I had to work through and resolve was, I hate even like saying it out loud, but being abandoned by my mother, right? That was, for me, growing up all my life, it was so easy just to play the strong card. Like, oh, I didn't need her anyway. And this wasn't a big deal to me, right? And I still don't feel personally like it was, like emotionally, I moved past that event a long, long time ago. It was not significant to me. I had a wonderful father who raised me and all those things. What's important to recognize, though, is that the trauma of not having a mother in my childhood years affected my ability to relate to women for a good piece of my young adult life. And it's also what led me to be in a position where I was willing to accept the affection and attention of any woman because I didn't have it. So, despite being in that position, going, I'm strong, because of this, and I am not emotionally
You're
affected,
beating
whatever.
your chest.
Yeah, you're in that
Right.
place where you're like, I'm not going to admit to
Yeah.
this. My decisions were still based off of it. I mean, the person that I chose to marry was not a good person, not for me, not for any reason. I mean, not a good person in I'm not saying in general. I mean, not a good person for me, right?
Yeah.
But I chose her because getting any attention and love from a woman was so unique to me. And it came from the fact that I didn't have a mother growing up.
Yeah, and that's a significant point, right? So there's the wound and then making choices because it's unresolved. But then it's not a core value. Like you would probably say during that time, like this was love.
Yeah.
Love was my core value, but it
Yeah.
wasn't. It was a pain.
It wasn't at all.
It was a trauma, right?
Yeah.
It was basically a trauma. And then what got you out of that was actually your core values of independence and growth. That's what got you through. So there's a trauma, and then the working through it, it's going to take your core values to get you through your traumas.
Yeah. And that's what's fascinating about it is I was completely opposed to acknowledging that I had any form of trauma whatsoever. And yet every one of my decisions were based on it. I even said things out loud like, I'm going to marry this person because nobody else in Utah would be able to love me the way I am. What a crazy statement to make that I'd made multiple times. Nobody else would be able to appreciate who I am.
And I'm sure at the time you're like, oh, this is humility.
Yeah.
Because this is love.
Yeah.
Versus like, man, that's just that's woundedness right there.
So that's one and maybe rather extreme example on my side. But what are some other examples of things?
So I ended up, there was a client that I worked with, and basically when he was young, he was basically picked on. Like his dad would always pick on him, like indirectly. And he would, his brothers would pick on him. And then eventually when he went to high school, what do you think happened to him?
The same.
He was getting picked on, right?
Yep.
And then he got a job. And then he actually was referred because what do you think happened at that job?
Getting picked on.
He was getting picked on.
Getting all the crap assignments and getting...
He was getting shit on. And then basically it went to HR, and then they sent him to see somebody. And then eventually he ended up bailing. Like even though he had a case, he was being bullied. He left. He fled.
Wow.
And then he quit the job. He couldn't, he was so afraid. Like there was so much anxiety there.
Yeah.
He was so afraid to actually go, even though he probably would have won the case if he stayed.
Yeah.
And so that was an example of a trauma that kept playing out over and over for him.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until he was able to trace back. It was like peeling layers of like, look, for you had this job in present time, which is the same thing that happened to you in high school, which is the same thing that happened to you in junior high, which is the same thing that happened to you when you were growing up. There's a pattern here, and you're kind of like unconsciously picking out of all the places that you could have worked. You picked the place that you're getting picked on.
Yeah.
That wasn't an accident.
Normal. I mean, it feels like...
It wasn't an accident.
Yeah.
Right. And so it was actually for him, it was recognizing that whenever he had that intense anxiety or this feeling like, oh, this place feels good, that's a trauma wound. And then he needs to actually not choose that place and then actually show more independence moving forward.
Just for fun, I'm gonna throw out another one. I'm gonna throw out a common trauma archetype that I think fits many people.
Okay.
Many successful people. And it also relates to things that I went through. Not feeling like you are good enough or smart enough growing up. So personally, it was believed that I was actually handicapped when I was younger. And that in elementary as well as junior high, they suggested that I go to like remedial education because I just wasn't interested in what was being taught. I didn't like to take tests. I didn't like to do what the teachers asks. And I have ADHD, right? So all of this, and back then we didn't know what we know now. So the way that it was perceived was that I was not intelligent. And my father bought into this, and most of my close friends bought into this narrative that I'm not intelligent. And it wasn't until I was 18, 19-ish that I actually started having experiences for myself that helped me to start understanding that I could learn. Now, at first, there was anger and resentment towards all the people that I felt had held me back. Then there was this overwhelming desire just to prove them wrong. And then it became, I'm going to be so driven that nobody can ever question my intelligence whatsoever. And a huge part of my focus became learning how to learn and then teaching people how to learn. I became an educator. So much of this became a trauma response to like the actual event of just everybody feeling that I'm not smart. I bought off on it myself until about when I was maybe around 32, 33-ish, when I started to develop my own sense of confidence, my own sense of worth and value. And then that underlying need to kind of show them, to prove, that went away. And it was replaced with, I just want to compete with myself and be the best possible version of me. And that's kind of the shift in mindset that led to my divorce and then to redirecting all that energy. And it's no longer about any of that. But I have to acknowledge and admit that the first 10 years of my success in business, in my career, school, all of it, it simply had to do with proving them wrong.
But it was, I feel like it's more than that. Like there was a mixture of the trauma was a motivating factor. And then through trying to figure out your trauma and work through that pain, your real core values started to emerge. And once you started living that truth, where your core values was your driving factor more than the pain, that's when you started to heal.
Could be. I mean, it could go a number of ways in that transition, right? Eventually, I got to a place where I no longer learned, worked, or did anything because of anyone else. I do it for myself. But what I'm acknowledging, like I think so many of our case studies, is that your success getting to that place was, in essence, a response to not feeling good enough.
No, agreed. But even more so, like in your example, you didn't fit into your environment.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't look the same, right? The beliefs, you're nothing that you did, like even the way of learning didn't fit.
For sure.
So it didn't fit who you were as a person, where you were trying to conform yourself to be a certain way, which was conformity. Like maybe the trauma was conformity in that way and it didn't work versus, through this process, you figured out who you were and what drove you.
For sure.
And that got you through.
Yeah, I think that's an important piece for everybody to understand about trauma, is that I think we can have a much easier time getting past the shame of it when we acknowledge that who we are, the strengths, the values, the person that we are now, the person that's worth being proud of, was developed because of that trauma. It came through that experiences. Those are the things that you develop to actually overcome.
Well, I mean, besides that, I think your example speaks to a healthier way of addressing trauma. Because like, for example, like people that suffer like extreme PTSD, they're told to like relive the experience, go back,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you have to kind of let the pain play out and go back to the past experiences versus, I love your example because this is what we do in CVFT is you're aware of your traumas, you're aware of your patterns, but you don't have to keep going back and reliving the experience.
Yeah.
You actually just shift it to your core values. And once you do that and you start letting go and making decisions based on your core values in present time, you're not only living a better life, but you're also healing your traumas at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
There's a duality to it.
Correct.
And in your story, that's the example that I love that you're bringing up.
Well, you can get to a place of success in any arena and still have not resolved the actual trauma. Like you can still be acting.
People can be resilient, but still live in their pain over and over and over again.
Correct.
Yeah.
And and it's a very interesting thing because we find that in a lot of case studies, we find that trauma might affect a person's area of life in one aspect, like their past trauma from childhood or from, let's say early dating life. We have a case study where early dating life has just led a person to believe that they don't feel confident or like they can assert themselves in the relationship at all, right? But that's not the way that they behave outside of their romantic relationships. Their behavior outside of their romantic relationships is in alignment with their actual values. Within romantic relationships, their behavior
is a trauma
is a
wound.
trauma wound.
And that's a common thing that happens all the time. Like you'll see people, if there's an emotional distance, they're living their truth and they're living a really good life because they're in line with their core values. And then once they get to this most intimate relationship, it's the complete opposite.
Yeah.
It's a trauma wound. They're basically picking a relationship based on unresolved baggage that they haven't taken care of.
Okay, I like talking through all of this stuff because number one, I think it's difficult for us to admit to have experienced trauma. And believe me, everybody has had trauma, some worse than others. And you know, the worst side of trauma, we would say, is like war, right? Going to war and coming back and having PTSD, that would be the worst case scenario. And then you experienced your own trauma in your past workplace, in that social working environment. And when you left and you got your brain scan, right?
Yeah.
What did it reveal?
That I had trauma.
To the extent of what?
That like I was very impulsive and I just couldn't really think straight during that time.
But specifically, I mean, your doctor said that this is like you just came back from war.
He literally said I came back from war, and then he put me on this medical model plan of you need to lower your expectations and live a more simplistic life.
That's wild. Like,
yeah.
That's what I think we don't understand is that, yes, a lot of us have what we might think are minor cases of trauma. Then a lot of us have minor to medium cases of trauma that are repeated on cycle. See, we tend to only think that wartime trauma is significant, right? But in reality, minor and you know, medium level, we're going to say wartime trauma is significant trauma.
Yeah.
We're going to say everything else in life is minor to medium trauma. Okay.
Yeah.
Minor to medium trauma, when accumulated, can be the same
as
war.
It's called cumulative trauma, and
exactly.
That's what I was suffering from. They were basically saying through the accumulation, it was like my brain was similar to a person in war.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's critical to understand this, especially in arenas where trauma is affecting our present day decisions in the career, decisions in, you know, our friendships and our romantic relationships and our family relationships.
But one thing I want to make a distinction on, because we did this in the previous podcast, is where we're different is a medical model. So like when that happened to me, they gave me a medical model treatment plan, which was,
again, symptomatic,
lower your expectations, relive the trauma wounds over and over when you get, you know, if you're having flashbacks or you're getting triggered, and just stay in that space and just go back and remember and then try to maintain your life, versus I'm going to figure out what my values are. I have a second chance. And then during this process of living my values, I can also make better decisions in present time. And then the better life I have now, by honoring what happened to me, I'm healing and I'm also living a better life.
Yeah.
And that was a distinction.
You know what's going to be crazy is when, so I think you and I both believe that core value focused therapy is going to revolutionize the way that we
do everything. Man.
Do everything.
Yeah.
But in 5 or 10 years, what's going to be really interesting is when you start pairing psychedelics with core value focused therapy in how you address trauma. Because what they're finding now,
extremely helpful.
Yeah, they're finding that psychedelics are actually very helpful in helping wartime veterans to actually overcome PTSD.
Yeah, and then even just basic yoga, even jujitsu, like the physical body movements, because they're communicating without talking. All of that is extremely helpful in PTSD.
Yeah. This entire medical model, I think, is going to shift dramatically over the next 20 to 30 years with everything. But it's fascinating, too, because the medical model is the way that it is because it's this giant moving ship. You know, you have it's difficult to turn the Titanic. You know, you have a giant cruise liner. It's difficult to turn when something's right in front of you. It's just too big. So the medical model does shift with time, but it's slow. And we see things like psychedelics, which 30, 40 years ago, we thought had no medical use or medical practice whatsoever. And they've all been demonized. Every drug has been demonized. And now finally, it's beginning to get to a place where we're thinking, okay, we shouldn't be demonizing everything. We should be learning proper usage. And when the research is actually being done, we're finding proper uses for almost all of these drugs.
Even cannabis, you can microdose and it helps with anxiety and depression and focus.
So where, I'm curious, and this is just a separate topic, but where is the medical model going to be 30 years from now once core values and once, the actual appropriate usage of drugs is incorporated? And instead of just this model of covering, because right now it's just covering and concealing. It's the same way with any other ailment, right? High cholesterol, go and take this pill.
Lipitor, baby.
Where's the lifestyle changes?
No, I agree. And then, hopefully this medical model will be about, it incorporates everything, like even spirituality and like purpose and all of those things versus just staying in this box of maintenance. And I understand the model. Like I live that model and use that model for 20 years, which is basically too much. You're going to get too stressed out. It's going to lead to depression. Too little, you're not motivated enough, and therefore you're going to get depressed.
Yeah.
You got to be in that right box.
Yeah.
And it's all about safety, perceived emotional safety.
Yeah.
Versus actually there is no safety. If you're not changing and growing, you're actually becoming more unsafe emotionally. You need to grow and progress with the times.
Okay, so what I'd like to get into is you described there's 3 kind of emotions that help us to process and overcome trauma, right? I think before we get to that, it'd be interesting to just give a couple examples of how trauma can help shape your core values and positive core values. And we gave a couple of those, but I want to just simplify it down. So going back to my own personal experience of feeling like you're not enough, that the people around you say that you're not intelligent, that you believe yourself that you're not intelligent. Then developing a core value centered around personal growth, being better than who I was yesterday, always achieving my potential. That was a response to the trauma. Now, for the first 10 years, I was doing those things because I wanted to feel like I was enough. Then it shifted over to I know I am. I can provide my own sense of love, my own sense of esteem. And now I do these things because I love doing them. It makes me better. It is why I am successful. It is why I'm who I am. What's another example?
I will say for me, like, growing up, independence was not preached. It's all about being controlled. And I had to honor the family, take care of the family. Like even when I got a job, my father at the time would tell me, you can only make this much because if you make more than that, we can't control you.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it was like this level of control, doing what they say, but then still achieving, but not achieving enough. So it was almost a medical model.
Yeah.
Upbringing almost, right? In this crazy extreme. And then they would always make excuses to me, to other families. Like, he's just not that driven. He just doesn't want to achieve. He's just lazy. And I would be in this bubble and I feel like, no, I feel like I want to achieve more. And then I would start picking jobs that were county. Because why is county a good job? Because it's safe. And how much do I make? Well, it's in that box that my parents wanted me to make. And I have the pension. And I was living in this bubble. So everything that I was doing was living in pain for like 12 to 13 years. Mm-hmm. Until my core value of independence and exploration and growth. Like once I honored that, and it was actually like it was forced to happen. Like I was almost glad it happened. Like when the whole lawsuit took place, like deep down, like my core value, that driven part of me was like, yeah, let's have this happen. So now I'm forced to play this out.
Yeah.
It was almost like, yes, let's have it. Let me lose everything. And I want to see what happens after that. There's almost an excitement to it because I wanted to live. I wanted to feel that passion and see if I could actually make it happen.
Well, you lived under the rules of that trauma until that point, basically. You followed those steps, even though it was going against everything that you were and who you were. So that was an example of like you just living a life based around your trauma until a point where the pain of continuing was worse than the pain of just giving it all up. And for those that don't know that story, we talked early on in our first introductory episodes, in the first 10, I think it was episode 9 and 10 where we went into our backstories. Yeah. And for those that haven't heard it, Dr. Glenn got to a place in his profession where he literally gave up. You gave up your license to practice social work.
Social work, yeah.
Because the environment and everything around it was just It was too toxic.
I was getting death threats.
You're getting death threats, and you were in this case that was dragging on, and eventually you just said, none of this is who I am. I'm not living the life that I want. And you basically push the reset button.
Yeah, and instead of like all these superficial things like be more active and hang out with your friends more, it was not enough because I was not living my truth or my core values.
Yeah.
And then when it happened, it was like a light bulb. Like I became really motivated and just naturally happier in my life.
So your trauma can lead to the development of positive core values. Your trauma can actually inhibit your ability to live your values. It can do any of these things. Our responses to them can shift. Another example that's a common archetype that we see is a person being hurt repeatedly by those that are close to them, right? Past trauma of like maybe they were betrayed, maybe they were cheated on, maybe they've dealt with a parent that constantly lied. And it's usually the same person. Like, my parents lied to me, my boyfriend cheated on me, then this happened. Then
it's just a pattern.
It's this pattern of being betrayed by those you love. And so what do they end up doing? Well, there's two sides to it. They either fall into relationships that fall into that archetype where they go, man, this is so familiar. It feels right. It feels, like you said, it feels euphoric.
It feels euphoric.
Or they flip the switch and go to the other extreme where they go, I'm going to find a person that is safe. All I want is a person that is honest and has a job, and that's it. And they make the decision on the other end of the extreme. Then they come down the road 5-10 years and they go, I don't love this person. This isn't, I wanted more for my marriage. Well, at the time, all you wanted was safe. Somebody that wouldn't lie to you and cheat on you.
Yeah.
But that should be a bare minimum.
That's such a low bar.
It's such a low bar. It should be a bare minimum of your relationship. And so they realize this person isn't, there's no reward in the relationship. I don't have regard for this person. I don't have a sense of satisfaction. They don't challenge me. They're none of those things. But what they are is safe. A direct response to your trauma.
Yeah. It's still a trauma relationship.
Yes.
Yeah. So even on the outside, it looks better. That's still a wound that you're playing out in your life.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you don't have to. And this is the one thing about like resilience. Like, resilience is a really good thing, but then I think people hold on to their traumas and they become too resilient. And I feel like there's a certain point where you have to say like, enough, man.
That's what you were doing in that job. I mean, you were holding on to the trauma and just, I'm doing so good. I can manage all this stuff. I can handle all these emergencies, one fire to the next fire.
And that was the thing. So once again, going back to that story, the medical model would say you were so resilient for 3 or 4 years. And then you had a breakdown.
Now you're unhealthy.
You're becoming unhealthy now because you just couldn't cope.
Yeah.
Versus like in my perspective, outside of the medical model, I was so unhealthy to be that resilient to cope.
Yeah.
And then when I had like the break and I was like, man, I can't do this anymore. That's when I became healthy.
That's what's insane about it. Because we're all, it's a survival. Resilience is a survival mechanism. Our software, this internal software that's had how many thousands of years of development has trained us to be able to deal with one fire to the next. But you're absolutely right. When you first said that to me, I was like, yeah, when you're jumping from one fire to the next and you're your most resilient, you're also the most unhealthy. We have to stop. We have to uncouple resilience from mental health. They are not one and the same thing.
Yeah. Resilience is it's a survival response, not a quality of life response.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
And then so people that are healthy, they're like, oh, I can't deal with that. That's gross. I'm out. That's a sign of health.
Okay. So you listed there's typically 3 emotional responses to trauma. Can you go into those?
Yeah. So just in general, there's what's known as guided emotions. They'll lead you in present time to kind of look at some of the things that you need to work through to heal your traumas. Okay. So instead of like this whole, let's replay the past and let's look at the most significant pain that you went through, you can just kind of look through your emotions in present time through your relationships.
Interesting.
And then kind of say like, okay, cool. Like it's a more indirect way of like, okay, these are the things that I need to do to work through my trauma and get to my core values. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
And those guided emotions are basically fear, anger,
and then indecision.
Indecision. Okay.
Yeah. So
it's basically fight, flight, freeze, right?
Yeah. They come from the fight, flight, freeze.
So anger to fighting.
Anger to fighting. Fear is
flight.
to running, right? Mm-hmm. And then freezing is when you're overwhelmed. You have so many emotions, you don't know what to do.
Or indecision.
Indecision, yeah.
Okay. So based on the way that we feel towards things, you're saying that we can, and I'm talking from the standpoint of our audience because I want you to explain this in a way that everybody can understand. We've already discussed this stuff and we already, but so forgive me for asking something that you know that I already understand, but go into those. So you're saying that in the moment we need to look at, let's say that, for example, we feel afraid.
Yeah. So any area of your life. So not just like normal fear, like someone's trying to run you over. Like that's a normal fear. Like you don't examine those fears. Or like, oh, someone's really trying to hurt you. Like run. Like that's what you should do. That's not a trauma, right? Yeah. But like when you look at relationships or like you go to work and there's anxiety in a meeting, like it's just beyond normal. Like it's beyond rational. That's a trauma wound, right? So anxiety or that triggered fear, you need to be more independent. So like, what are the skill sets that you need to develop to have more independence in that field? Like maybe you need to be more assertive. You need to work on your ability to public speak. You need to work on your communication skills or conveying information at that moment. So any anxiety in relationships or the places that you're at that you feel you need the skill sets to establish more independence in that.
Okay.
And if you do that, you're starting to heal that trauma of dependency.
So how about anger?
So anger comes from the fight to protect, right? So when you look at the relationships in your life, not just angry, like someone pushed me or someone said F you, of course you're gonna get angry, not that kind of anger, but a real triggered anger that goes beyond that. And it's gonna be either three things. So like if I'm really angry at you, Pye, like really triggered, like you didn't even do anything, but I'm just really angry. I'm either angry at you because I'm seeing a characteristic in myself that I don't like, and I'm just seeing it in you, but I'm really not, I'm not acknowledging that.
You're internalizing it, yeah.
Yeah, I'm projecting, right? The second is I'm jealous. Like you may have something like you're doing so well in life and I don't have it, and therefore there's a hatred there or an anger there because I actually want what you have. And then the third one is there's a belief system that's holding me back. Like, oh, you can make it because your family took care of you. So, if I had the same opportunity, I could make it. So I would need to let go of that belief that I'm being triggered.
Okay. And indecision then.
And the indecision, so that comes from being overwhelmed, right? So when you're overwhelmed, instead of making a decision, it's just letting go of things. When you know your core values, you can start letting go of relationships or people that don't serve you. And once you start doing that, it starts clearing the way and opening yourself up to actually what you want in life.
Okay. So give us then some practical examples, some case studies that help to kind of drill these in.
So I had she was working for a company, and then basically she came in and she was like, I hate my supervisor. And then why do you hate her? She's such a biatch, right? And she's like arrogant and she's egotistical and I can't stand her. And then so once we started exploring that, I was like, why? But she's a supervisor. She's successful, right? And then ultimately all the hate came down to, I want that job. I want her position.
Interesting.
And then so
what if the supervisor is actually just a bad person?
Then you're not going to be that triggered. You're just going to be like, well, I'm going to stay away from this person.
Interesting.
But once you're like obsessed with this person, there's something that needs to be worked through. Right? Like I was talking about last night, like I got stuff I got to work through.
We all got stuff. We all still got stuff we got to work through.
Family, man, I get like there's stuff I got to work through, but like when you really get bothered by someone, like, man, I hate that person. She was hating her because she was jealous of her.
Yeah.
Like she wasn't doing anything like spiteful. She wasn't like trying to make her life miserable. She just hated the fact that she was doing well in life.
Yeah.
And then once she acknowledged that, this is the other thing. She was angry at her, and then she was angry at her friends. She's like, all of my friends are so dependent upon me because I always have to give them advice for everything. And she was like, I hate people that are dependent. So on the outside, it was like, okay, she's very independent because she's giving so much advice. But in truth, when her life goes out of sorts, what do you think she does? She starts telling people what to do and controlling them, right? That is her dependency. So she had to acknowledge the hatred that she had for people being dependent is because she herself is actually a very dependent person.
Yeah.
Right? And then the third thing was she was like, the other reason I hate that lady is because no one in my family went to college. And she's able to go to college, but I got kids and I can't go to college. So I hate that. So once we took all of the things that she was angry about, number one, you need to be more independent, because even though you're acting like you're controlling people and you're being independent, you're being very dependent. So you need to establish your independence. Number two, you need to go talk to your supervisor and ask her about what school she went to. How did she go? How did she get her degree? Because she also has a family, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, number 3, break the limiting belief that she can't go to college, right? So all of that happened just by honoring her anger triggers.
Mm.
And then she went.
I feel like I could talk about this topic all day long, but I'm going to have you real time therapize me right here on the air. One of the things, I mean, we all have things that we work to get past, right?
Yeah.
One of the things that I've worked on hard to not allow to bother me, not allow to trigger me, is hypocrisy. I cannot stand. I mean, you could say that I would have a very strong anger response to hypocrisy.
Okay.
So what there would you first go into?
Who's the, like, without naming names, who's the person that you're like, man, I hate them because they're such a hypocrite? Like, it triggers you really badly.
There's not any one person in particular. It's more so like experiences where I find myself willing to kind of put someone in their place. Let's say, for example, when I used to attend church, right? 5 years ago, 6 years ago, somebody being in a place where you preach Christ and loving and all these things. You've been a member for 30 years of your life.
Mm-hmm.
And you're telling me that I shouldn't be photographing gay weddings and that these people shouldn't be getting married.
But that's appropriate though. Like that's not like you're actively searching out hypocrisy your whole life. Like that's just something when it's presented to you, you're like, I hate that. I have an example of that you brought up before.
Okay.
If that's okay.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned a person that you're like, man, like I hate this person because they're a little bit narcissistic and they're only into themselves. And then it's hard to talk to them sometimes. And I get really triggered. And then I'm really trying to reach this person over and over and over again.
Yeah, to get them to understand, to get them to see my view.
And I don't know why this person gets on my ass, but I'm always pissed off, right?
Yeah.
And then we talked about it and it was like, because part of you have some narcissistic tendencies too.
Sure.
There's like a confidence level, there's an esteem, there's sometimes a grandiosity there, just like that person.
For sure.
So you're like, and then remember once we reversed, there's like, it's not to that level, but there's a trigger of like, man, I have these qualities too. I can have these qualities. And then once you saw it, you're like, okay, cool. I'm going to set more boundaries with this person.
And in that instance, I could also see that that was a case where that person had things that I wanted.
Yeah.
And it wasn't things like possession things. It was emotional things, like that person's ability to not care about anything.
That's such a great quality.
Yeah, that person's ability to just like separate themselves and to just live this simplicity. Those were things that you helped me to identify. And it's also the place where we started talking about the idea of healthy narcissism, where we need to bring that onto the podcast too. But where I'm going, yeah, you're right, Glenn. I am narcissistic too. I think that I try to balance it out with awareness and emotional awareness and whatnot. But it's true that I value that relationship because that person is also highly confident and it makes me more so. So absolutely. So you're saying that basically in the case of hypocrisy and in those cases, because it can be whatever. I had someone who was openly racist to me when I was younger, like openly, like willing to beat me up and that kind of stuff when I was in junior high. Later, come to me and preach love and say, I'm so sorry. And all I'm about now is love. And it didn't feel like it was genuine. It just felt like an act. It felt like they were in a position that they needed everybody's acceptance because they were in a higher position, spiritually or in the church or whatever, religiously.
Yeah. It was self-serving.
And in those moments, like I would like to think that I could I think putting someone in their place, there is a place for that, right? I think that there is a right type of anger and being upset in those moments. But what's crazy is these moments burn into my mind, like the lady in church about photographing gay weddings, like the guy who was racist and is now talking about love and acceptance. They burn themselves into my memory, and that's where I'm like.
But let me ask you this: the photography one, I think anyone would be burned by that. Like that's just wrong. You're just a bad person, right?
But they're in a place where they're literally
but that's what makes it
trying
worse.
to be a good person.
So if you weren't bothered by that, that would mean you're kind of an asshole. If you're not bothered by it,
Yeah.
right? And then the second example, if a person is doing, if it's not sincere and you feel like it's not sincere, to me that's appropriate annoyance, right? Like it doesn't feel good. Like, yeah, there's something not right with you. Like it's still self-serving, and then you just like, I'm irritated. I don't see anything wrong with that.
Yeah. Well, I would say that I agree with you. I do feel like you've helped to kind of identify in one case, the anger is not necessarily justified. And that's where you can start looking in and seeing like, okay, these are areas where the other person is doing things that I really should be doing for myself. And these are things that I recognize in myself. Absolutely. And the other cases, you can have the anger that is justified. But I do also have to acknowledge, and I have to say that the anger that I feel towards those hypocritical moments is also based around trauma wounds.
Because of what
The
you
level,
experienced?
yes, the level of anger towards that is at a very different degree.
I see.
Someone cutting me off on the road, I'm good. I'm fine.
Yeah.
Someone, going in like, maybe they sold me something for $100 more than they should have, right? They took advantage of me. Fine, whatever. I can let go of most everything, but the level of anger towards hypocrisy is, for me, trauma related.
Because of that you experienced it so much growing up.
Correct.
So that it is actually a trigger beyond, like this person was apologizing. You could take it at face value, be like, cool.
Correct.
But it still triggers you because it goes beyond this person. I see.
Exactly.
I see. So is it possible for you to forgive?
Sure. And
like if it's still triggering you, that means that the wound is still there, meaning that it's about forgiving and letting it go. Like people can be hypocritical. Like maybe it's redefining how you see people, letting go of this limiting belief that people are like that person. Like you could say, oh, this person is being fake.
mm-hmm.
Or you can take that limiting belief and blow it up and say like, this person is in the process of change. Even though it's not 100%, this person isn't 100% being genuine. I could feel it. They're in the process of change.
Yeah. Forgiveness for me is, I can work to that place where I forgive and I let go of the emotional attachment to that thing, but I don't forget, and I don't
but you don't need to
generally want to have anything to do with that person.
Of course. It doesn't mean you're going to be best friends, but just, okay, cool, man. Like I'm going to see this as you're on your path. It helped me to move on. This trigger is helping me to say, okay, cool. I'm going to reframe people and say, I'm going to see you in a more forgiving lens.
But in the example, I would say that that's the closest example I could give to your example with your family. When you give your example of the level of anger that you have,
it gets triggering. And then it's not even that bad sometimes. They're just doing annoying things.
Correct.
But I have work to do. Like when I'm like, oh, this person is selfish, I can be really selfish.
And that's the same place that I recognize that when it comes to this particular topic, I have work to do because my response is to a level that goes beyond. It's not proportionate.
Yeah. But that's what lets you know that that's a trauma being triggered.
Correct.
Yeah. And then you have the opportunity to work it out in present time.
But I think that's helpful to know too. Like when your level of anger is not proportionate to the action.
Yeah.
There's trauma there.
There's trauma there. And the same thing with fear. If the fear is not proportional to the actual event, like it's going way beyond, that is a trauma there. If you're feeling so overwhelmed with something that's not that big of a deal, that is a trauma that you need to work through.
So in wrapping this up, we can kind of attach that fear, the anger, and the indecision. If it's natural in certain circumstances to have all three of those things, not at the same time, but like to experience those things is natural. But when you're experiencing them to a degree that goes well beyond the activity itself,
yes,
then what we're talking about is trauma wounds.
It's a trauma wound. It's coming out in this kind of surface emotion.
I like the way that we simplified that down to something really nice right there. That was nice.
I like that. I like that we're being narcissists. We're complimenting ourselves right now.
Healthy narcissism for the win.
All right, awesome.
Another topic for another time.
Yeah.
All right. We hope you guys have enjoyed this episode. Again, if you all are interested in individual or couples coaching, you guys can jump on to 12weekrelationships.com. We have a lot of inquiries coming in. Dr. Glenn still has a few openings on the schedule, but we're doing the wait list so that we can kind of, as openings come up on the schedule, we reach out to people and get them signed up. Those are 12-week programs. The cost is right around $2,000 at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
There will be kind of price changes as we go, but if you guys are interested, jump into that as soon as possible before Dr. Glenn gets all booked up. In the meantime, though, well, we have several things going on. First, we'd love for you guys to subscribe to the podcast. If this is the first episode you listen to, you guys can jump onto Spotify, iTunes, you can go onto YouTube, where you can actually search by topics. We have tons of different episodes up. And you can also join our newsletter on 12weekrelationships.com so we can send you lovely weekly tips and tricks that are completely free, things to help you improve your relationships, including the one that you have with yourself. That's it for us.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. If you guys want to reach out to us, you can find us on Instagram at 12week relationships, where you can DM us, ask us. Well, we don't do advice or therapy over DM, but you can submit questions that we can bring onto the podcast. You can also tell us what you think. And if you think the podcast is awesome, you can do us a solid and jump onto the iTunes store and leave a podcast review. There are a billion ways to get in touch with us, participate with us, and we love that you're here. So thanks.
Thank you so much.
Peace.